The rain in Normandy doesn't just fall, it colonizes the soul, turning the earth into a sucking, gray mire that swallows men and machines alike. It is July 1944. General Patton stands at the edge of his command tent, his face a roadmap of grit and exhaustion, staring at maps of the Norman hedgerows. For 2 months, the Allied advance has been a butcher's bill measured in yards, a static nightmare of green walls and hidden German 88s. At Supreme Headquarters, the air is clean, and the talk is of methodical consolidation and logistical readiness. General Eisenhower and General Bradley discuss a slow, 2-week exploitation phase. But to a man born for the charge, these phrases taste like ash. When the radio crackles with the activation of the Third Army, the order is clear: wait for the fuel reserves to stabilize. Patton looks at the 3 silver stars on his rain-slicked helmet, then at the disorganized mess of the German lines. He abruptly severs the radio link to Versailles, a silent act of defiance. The wait order is dead. The Blitzkrieg is born. Before we continue, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The rain in Normandy doesn't just fall, it colonizes the soul, turning the earth into a sucking, gray mire that swallows men and machines alike. General Patton stood at the edge of his command tent, his face a roadmap of grit and exhaustion, staring at the maps of the Norman hedgerows. For 2 months, the Allied advance had been a butcher's bill measured in yards, a static nightmare of green walls and hidden German 88s. At headquarters, the talk was of methodical consolidation and logistical readiness, phrases that tasted like ash to a man born for the charge. When the radio crackled with the official activation of the Third Army, the orders from Bradley were clear: support the flank and wait for the fuel reserves to stabilize. Patton didn't wait. He looked at the 3 silver stars on his rain-slicked helmet and then at the disorganized mess of the German lines. "We aren't digging in," he barked to his corps commanders, his voice cutting through the thunder. He abruptly severed the radio link to Versailles, a silent act of defiance. The wait order was dead. The Blitzkrieg was born. The hedgerows finally buckled under the weight of Operation Cobra's firestorm, leaving a jagged breach in the German crust. While the rest of the Allied machine paused to reorganize, Patton's Third Army surged through the gap like liquid fire. He didn't stop to count his losses or wait for the flanking units to find their footing. He simply gave the order to attack with everything. The terrain that had stifled progress for months suddenly became a blur of motion. Patton's armor swept past smoldering wrecks and abandoned foxholes, moving with a velocity that defied the maps at headquarters. Behind him, the logistical tail of the army was stretched to a snapping point. Supply trucks, burdened by the mud and the frantic pace, fell miles behind the lead tanks. Patton's commanders were stunned, reporting advances of 30 and 40 miles a day through territory that was supposed to be heavily contested. Keep moving was the only directive that mattered. If a unit slowed down to consolidate, Patton was there, his face etched with grim determination, pushing them forward. He was betting the entire campaign on the shock of speed, leaving his own safety and his supply lines to chance in a desperate race against the clock. While the Allied command struggled to update their maps, a different kind of panic gripped the German high command. General Paul Hauser, commander of the German 7th Army, stared at intelligence reports that felt like fiction. The Americans weren't just attacking. They were appearing in places that should have been days away. In the German bunkers, the most urgent and terrifying question became, where is Patton? They didn't have an answer because the Third Army was moving too fast for the German reports to travel. By the time a defensive line was identified, Patton's tanks had already swept past that position, turning the German flank into a sieve. Hauser's staff insisted the intelligence must be wrong, arguing that no army could maintain such a pace without collapsing under its own logistics. But Patton's Ghost Army was proving that speed was its own form of protection. The Germans, who had mastered the Blitzkrieg years prior, now found themselves the victims of it. They were no longer fighting a structured battle. They were reacting to a phantom that struck, vanished, and reappeared 50 miles deeper into their territory. The initiative was gone, replaced by the realization that Patton had outrun their ability to command. The velocity of the Third Army finally hit a wall that no amount of courage could scale: the gas gauge. By August 3rd, the fuel crisis was no longer a warning on a logistics report. It was a physical reality grounding the steel beasts of the 4th Armored Division. Patton's quartermaster arrived with a face like a funeral, reporting that the supply trucks were hundreds of miles behind and the tanks would be bone dry in 36 hours. The wait order from headquarters began to echo again, fueled by the logic that an army without gas is just a collection of expensive targets. Patton, however, viewed logistics as a challenge rather than math. "The Germans have fuel," he snapped, "and we're going to take it." He ordered his men to scavenge every drop, siphoning gasoline from captured enemy depots and sifting through the wreckage of destroyed convoys. He stripped fuel from non-combat vehicles, telling his own headquarters staff that if they wanted to keep up, they could damn well learn to walk. It was logistics by improvisation, a desperate, scrounging strategy that kept the tanks rolling on fumes and sheer audacity, proving that the Third Army's real engine wasn't powered by gasoline, but by its commander's refusal to stop. Having secured the rugged terrain of Brittany, Patton executed a maneuver that defied every textbook at West Point. Instead of pausing to reduce the remaining German-held ports, a task the brass considered mandatory, he ordered his entire army to pivot. In a display of tactical brilliance that bordered on madness, over 200,000 men and thousands of vehicles turned 90 degrees in mid-stride. They transitioned from a westward drive to an eastward surge, aiming straight for the heart of France and the city of Paris. This massive reorganization occurred in under 48 hours, a feat that should have resulted in catastrophic traffic jams and paralyzed supply lines. However, Patton's staff, working under the lash of his relentless expectations, managed the chaos through sheer force of will. The German defenders, expecting a slow siege of the coast, were left guarding empty space while the Third Army roared toward the Seine. Patton was no longer just breaking through lines. He was redrawing the map of Europe. He understood that the ports were irrelevant if the war could be won in a single, lightning stroke toward the German border. At Allied headquarters in Versailles, the map markers were moving so fast they were practically blurring. Eisenhower stood over the table, his coffee cooling as he traced the impossible trajectory of the Third Army. The original strategic timeline had predicted a reach toward the Seine by mid-September. It was now only August 19th, and Patton's lead elements were already securing bridgeheads across the river. The room was thick with a mixture of professional awe and logistical dread. Patton had managed to stay 4 weeks ahead of schedule, a feat that bypassed every safety margin established by the planners. Good God! Eisenhower finally breathed, the words escaping him in a mix of admiration and disbelief. He's already there. The 5 words echoed through the silent room, punctuating a moment where military theory had been utterly dismantled by a single man's aggression. Patton wasn't just defeating the Germans. He was outrunning the very concept of a front line. While the rest of the Allied machine was still calculating the cost of the next mile, Patton had already cashed the check and was looking toward the German border. The momentum of the Third Army was a physical force, a tidal wave of steel that seemed destined to wash over the German border before the autumn leaves could turn. Patton stood on the hood of his Jeep, looking through binoculars at the distant, rolling hills of the Saar region. The German defense had dissolved into a series of panicked retreats. The West Wall was within his grasp. He could taste the end of the war, believing that one final, aggressive lunge across the Rhine would collapse the Third Reich entirely. His commanders were ecstatic, reporting that the enemy was in such total disarray that they were surrendering to kitchen trucks and mail carriers. But the final obstacle wasn't a German division. It was an empty fuel hose. As Patton prepared for the killing blow, the bureaucratic brake was pulled at headquarters. Eisenhower, faced with a logistical nightmare and pressure from Field Marshal Montgomery, diverted the precious flow of gasoline north. The Third Army's tanks, which had outrun every expectation of modern warfare, finally sputtered and died. Patton stood in the silent, motionless center of his armored columns, a warrior stripped of his sword not by the enemy, but by the very command he had worked so hard to outpace. The stillness that followed the fuel cutoff was more deafening than the roar of the guns. Across a front that had been screaming with momentum just hours prior, thousands of Sherman tanks sat like iron tombstones in the French countryside. Patton stood at the edge of a ridge, looking toward the Rhine through the haze of a crisp September morning. He knew the history books would call this a logistical necessity, but to him, it was a tragedy of caution. The German army, which had been a broken, fleeing rabble, was already beginning to dig in on the far side of the border, gifted the one thing they needed most: time. In the final analysis, the story of the Third Army's race was not just a chronicle of miles gained, but of a fundamental clash in philosophy. Patton had proven that speed could substitute for mass, and that audacity could bypass the need for perfect planning. As he looked back at his silent columns, his face was a mask of grim reflection. He had outrun the Germans, outrun the maps, and even outrun the imagination of his superiors. He had shown the world that in the chaos of war, the greatest risk is often not moving fast enough, leaving a legacy that would forever be defined by 5 words of stunned disbelief. Good God, he's already there. History remembers the men who follow the rules, but it belongs to the men who broke them. If you believe that speed and audacity are the only ways to win your own battles, then don't just stand there waiting for the perfect moment. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the stories of the rebels who moved when the world told them to wait. Stay bold, keep moving, and we'll see you in the next one.